Here we go. Okay, so the Al-Aqsa to the Crusades. The last time we talked about the history of Jerusalem, we had gotten to the point where the Muslims had conquered Jerusalem and they had built the Dome of the Rock. And the there are really two fixtures on the on the Temple Mount of Muslim persuasion. They are, as you can see here, there's the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this one here, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is actually that is that's the edifice that was built for Friday prayers. The Dome of the Rock actually covers a stone which is very important to the Jews. It is it is sort of the foundation stone upon which the Beit Hamikdash itself stood. But and that was the first. The Muslims are going to claim that as the rock that Muhammad made his journey from. But the place where they got together for prayers, that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that is built by, and you'll forgive me, there are lots of, Ibns and Abids and Abbas, and all these names are difficult for me. I'm sure they're difficult for you. I don't know that we need to remember all of the names here, but it started by Abd al-Malik, and then it is finished by his son, whose name is Al-Walid the First. And it's finished in the year 714. And what is interesting is in order to pay for the building of this mosque, they had to melt down some of the gold on the Dome of the Rock. This, by the way, is going to become a consistent theme. It's going to be a theme that Muslims from time to time will melt down the gold on the Dome of the Rock in order to finance various parts of empire. In this case, it was in order to build the next expansion, the place for where their Friday prayers took place. Here we go. So and in 717, this begins the Caliph Umar II becomes the ruler of all the Islamic lands, and as we're going to see, he prevents the Jews from worshiping in the temple era. And so Umar belongs to a group of Islamic rulers who are going to be known as the Umayyads. And they became very corrupt, and they became self-serving, and they really were, in the eyes of many, they were betraying the fundamental principles of Islam. And what happens next is rather gruesome and fascinating. They are overtaken by a different group of Muslims. These Muslims are going to be known as the Abbasids. And the Abbasids are engaged in really almost a secret 40-year war to undermine the Umayyad Empire. And if you read the email that went out, I said that this is the true Red Wedding. And in my reading from this, there were lots of comparisons between this and HBO's hit series called The Game of Thrones. So apparently in The Game of Thrones, there is some episode where lots of people are invited to the wedding, and the people are, the guests of the wedding, many of the guests of the wedding are slaughtered at the wedding itself, and that it becomes known as the Red Wedding. Well, like most things in Hollywood, there are very interesting origins in history. And this particular event may well have been the inspiration for that particular cinematic moment. What happens? So as I said, there's a 40-year war where the Abbasids are going to oust the Umayyads. And the Umayyads are essentially vanquished. They're invited to a peace banquet. And in this peace banquet, the servants of the Abbasids are instructed to slaughter all of the members of the Umayyad family who thought they were invited to a peace banquet. And then, after they slaughter all of the members of this family, they take a big leather tablecloth, they spread it out, and they begin to feast upon the dead bodies, not on the flesh itself, but literally on top of the dead bodies of their vanquished members of the former royal family. There was, however, one member of the Umayyad royal family who decided, you know what, maybe I'll make other plans that night. And he turns out to be Abd al-Rahman. And Abd al-Rahman essentially realizes that he is no longer going to have an Umayyad throne, and he takes his talents to Spain. And he is the one who conquers Spain with some help from the Jews roughly around the same time. He is the Rock of Gibraltar is essentially Tariq is one of his soldiers who conquers at this time, and he is the one who's going to essentially unify Arab control of Spain at that time. And he sees himself, interestingly, as a sort of a partner state to his Abbasid cousins. Now, I know that you're all thinking right now, you know what, Rabbi, I signed on to Jewish history, the history of Jerusalem, and right now you're telling me about the people, all of these different Arabs and Muslims who had conquered vast lands, but I haven't heard anything about the Jews. Well, I'm going to ask you to wait for just another couple minutes before we get to the Jews. We just want to see one other thing. The Abbasids were very progressive in many ways, and they moved the capital of the empire from Ctesiphon to Baghdad. And Baghdad is a fascinating city. Baghdad is a planned city of concentric circles. It is meant to be a city of scholars. It is meant to be a city of learning. And the Arabs were, we have this notion of Arabs in Afghanistan sort of taking the country backwards and getting rid of every kind of foreign influence that possibly could be imagined. But really, that's not a fair brush to paint all of the caliphates with. And the Abbasid Caliphate was very progressive. The Abbasid Caliphate was very interested in knowledge. And so they went out to Constantinople and they said, by the way, we hear that you have in your library a copy of Ptolemy's geography. Could you please lend us that copy? We'd like to translate it into Arabic. They discovered that all of the Greek classics that later are translated into Latin are first translated into Arabic here in Baghdad. That this Arab center is the one that collects all of it is the one that collects all of the scientific wisdom from across the world at that time. And they are very, in a way, culturally blind. They will take from the Greeks, they take paper from the Chinese, they get Arabic numerals from India, which are much better for multiplication than Roman numerals. They take the idea of zero, they get decimal places from India, and all of these things come together. And as does a great interest in philosophy. Now, why do we care about this? Well, anybody care to tell me before I click to the next slide who wrote the first work of Jewish philosophy and when?
Saadia Gaon.
Saadia Gaon, correct. And Saadia Gaon lives in not far from Baghdad. He lives not far from Baghdad, almost in the center of this empire, and he writes the first work of Jewish philosophy, which is Saadia Gaon's Book of Belief and Opinions, and is written in Judeo-Arabic, which means it's Arabic written in Hebrew letters. And you'll forgive me, there's a bit of self-serving family pride here. The book Saadia Gaon Beliefs and Opinions was originally translated from the Arabic, the Judeo-Arabic, the Arabic and the Hebrew, by Samuel Rosenblatt, which happens to be my grandfather. And so this is an important change in the way the world works, is because now the Jews are in being cultivated in a special environment that really prizes knowledge, and you get works of Jewish thought that are very much inspired by this culture of knowledge. The Arabs like to refer to themselves. One of the conquerors said that ours is a garden protected by our spears, right? That this is a place where you can flourish. It is our spears that allow this to happen. And generally speaking, the Abbasids were fairly tolerant of the different religions that lived within their domain. Very rarely do we see outright religious persecution, and we'll even see that some of the religious persecution that gets onto the books is actually rarely practiced. Just an example of that is the Christian quarter in Jerusalem was originally established when the representatives of Charlemagne pay the head tax on behalf of Charlemagne to the Christians, and so that's what creates the Christian quarter of Jerusalem. But the question that I think burns in my mind is, where are the Jews during this time? Can anyone name any famous Jews, buildings, or events that took place between 800 and 1099? Now, I already gave away probably the most famous Jew who lived in this time. But go ahead, somebody give me somebody famous from this period of time. A book, a name. Who are we looking at here?
Rambam.
Rambam lives after this time. Rambam lives already in the 12th century.
Sharira Gaon and the Tshuvot of Sharira Gaon.
Okay, Sharira Gaon. So anybody named Gaon, right? We'll get to why they're named Gaon in a little while, but all of the Gaonim live in this time. But really, when we talk about famous rabbis, generally speaking, in your Talmud Torah class, in your Hebrew Academy class, generally speaking, they're going to tell you about Rashi and Rambam and Ramban, and right, the names that you hear in between the Talmud and Rashi. It's almost as if most people have trouble coming up with any names. And
there's also the Rif.
The Rif, but he's also, at the very edge of this period, maybe even afterwards. I have to look up exactly when the Rif lived. And he lives in northern Spain. So the question is, what happened? Did the Jewish community survive this Muslim invasion? And the reason why this is, I think, important, and just to give you a face to challenge yourself on that, is the following. Is this gentleman, Shlomo Sand, is a Jew of, I believe, French extraction, and he was a professor at Tel Aviv University. And he writes this book, which is called The Invention of the Land of Israel. And he has some rather wacky theories, but he represents, he's a professor at Tel Aviv University. This book got serious attention. And he essentially makes these wild and, I think, dubious claims that the Jews are really Europeans who were descended from the Khazars, that most of the Jews that were probably came into the fold of the religion by proselytizing of the Jews somewhere between the 1st and the 4th century. There was no such thing as the Roman exile, because Romans never exiled anyone. And, his assumption is that that the idea of Jews as a genealogical group is ludicrous. What I think is important for us to understand, there are two things. One is you have to understand what it means in terms of Jewish continuity. What does it mean to be Jewish? I don't think any of us believes that Judaism is a purely genealogical phenomenon, that the only Jews worth considering are Jews whose DNA goes back to, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who goes back to Moshe, who goes back to Yehuda and Levi and the children of Jacob, that unless you're 100% pure without a single convert in between, that we're not interested in you. I think that's patently false. I mean, look, even our best stories incorporate people like Ruth into the picture. we understand that there are people who join us and that they become literally, as Ruth, the mother of kings. So leaving that aside, leaving his genealogical focus aside, what's important for us to know is that we are not an invented people, and that what is important about the Jewish people is a shared sense of history, destiny, and Jewish law. Excuse me. That we have this conception of ourselves as lighting Shabbos candles the same way that people lit Shabbos candles in the year 850 and the same way that people lit Shabbos candles in the year 450. That when we put on tefillin, the tefillin look like the tefillin of the year 450, and they look like the year 875, and they look like the year 1475 and 1975 and 2025. Should it come upon us peacefully. The continuity of Judaism as a group of people who have shared a common Siddur, mission, etc., is very important. And so I think it's important for us to, and in a way, the reason I embark on this Jewish history and the history of Jerusalem is for our community to know, to be able to connect the dots in between the textually rich times of the Talmud and of Rashi and of the modern era, and then also the textually sparse times that we're looking at right now. The Jews under the Muslims, this period is a time when we build fewer buildings and we write fewer grand books. And where do we get some of these things? So we get them from the Cairo Geniza. And one of the books that has been very helpful to me is A History of Palestine, 634 to 1099 by Moshe Gill. And he takes out much of his information from the Cairo Geniza. So the Cairo Geniza is a storehouse of documents, all sorts of documents written in many different languages, including many of them in Arabic. And these documents give us the picture of what's going on during this time. Moshe Gill, actually a couple of interesting things. First of all, the Cairo Geniza, their documents are written on vellum and paper. And so without the Abbasids conquering this entire land, without the Abbasids bringing in paper from China, interestingly enough, this treasure trove of documents in the Cairo Geniza may be only half full because we don't have paper. So I think that's just one interesting thing. But I have to pause here for a moment to just tell you the story of Moshe Gill. So Moshe Gill got his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 2 years, which in and of itself is absolutely remarkable. And I found a story online about Moshe Gill. I was interested in who this guy was as I'm reading through this book. And it's an excellent, excellent book. Very, very well researched and documented. And so this gentleman says that, I sat next to Moshe Gill, and I once asked him, how did he know this sort of strange Slavic language? And he told me, well, casually, that when he was in prison, a fellow inmate taught it to him. So this I guess, classmate of his says, at the time, I was so startled, I didn't ask him for details. And it was only later that he realized that he had been sentenced to 25 years in prison in Romania in 1942 because he was a leader of the subversive group known as Hashomer HaTzair Zionist Underground. And then later, after the war ended, he's released from prison. He emigrates to the land of Israel in 1945. He becomes a founding member of Kibbutz Reshafim, ultimately becomes a professor, and his area of expertise is this period and the Cairo Geniza, in which he brings numerous documents to light that give us a real interesting sense of the texture and feel of this time period. So I just had to pause for a moment and give you a little bit about Moshe Gill. Okay, so what do we learn from this time period? So now getting down to Jerusalem and getting down to what was happening in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, at that time. So we learn that, for example, we know that in 807 there was a decree by Harun al-Rashid about houses of prayer, and that was to destroy all the houses of prayer. This, by the way, is the same gentleman who accepted the Charlemagne and his gift to pay the head tax. And so apparently there was a law in the books that there should be no houses of prayer. There should be no synagogues in all of Jerusalem. But what do you know? If you look in the Cairo Geniza, you discover that this is a little bit different. In the Cairo Geniza, we see that there are constructions of synagogues, some of which clearly date from the 11th century. And so that we know that they can, even though there may have been a decree here or there to eliminate synagogues, in fact, not only were they in continuous operation, but some of them were rededicated or newly dedicated, which incidentally is something that very often under Islamic law wasn't really officially permitted, but because the Muslims really did wanted this to be a garden protected by their spears, they often looked the other way. And if you survey the full Geniza, you can see that there is Jewish presence in all of these different places. You can see that you have Jews in Ramallah, Tiberia, Tyre, Acre, Haifa, Gaza, Rafia, and Eilat. And I just put a pin on the map in every one of those places. And interestingly, one of the places that we know about, we sort of knew that there was a Jewish community in Tiberia, because it's maybe one of the oldest Jewish communities after the temple is destroyed, and through conquest of Romans and Christians, we've seen over and over again the Jews are not really allowed into Jerusalem. That even on Tisha B'Av, sometimes they were let in on Tisha B'Av to mourn over their temple. Sometimes they were not let in on Tisha B'Av to mourn over their temple. And so the center of Jewish learning, the Jerusalem Talmud, is probably written in Tiberia. But we have interesting evidence of what was going on in Tiberia. There is a colony of lepers. We learn from the Geniza that they write, and the Geniza document says, from boils there is no release. With eczema, the decrease. Some are deaf, some are sorry, you'll forgive my typing into this. I didn't even double check that. Some are blind, some are lame and dumb, and the like. It speaks of the tormented brethren of the city of Tiberia, right? And this extreme and terrible hunger, right? And people were solicited. The letter is essentially a solicitation letter. Please send money to the yeshiva, to the colony of lepers in Tiberia. And so I love it. I love the idea that part of the snippets we have from Jewish history is that we're finding that the communities of the world are trying to their goal is to rescue the sick who are in this colony outside Tiberia. Another thing that we discover from the Geniza fragments is that the yeshiva itself moves from Tiberia to Jerusalem. And it's fascinating, some of the evidence you get from the letters. We have a letter that talks about how much revenue is being collected for kashrut, essentially, by the Palestinian head of the yeshiva, who is called Al-Tabarani. Al-Tabarani is sort of the Judeo-Arabic word for the Tiberian. He's from Tiberia, but the yeshiva is in Yerushalayim. And we have a dedication in a Brit Milah, and it says, with the authority of the Nasi, the Gaon of Tiberia, who is the head of the yeshiva in Jerusalem. And so it's fascinating. By the way, this is not a super strange phenomenon. If you go to the Telsha Yeshiva, it is no longer in the city of Tels. It is outside of Chicago. If you go to the Hebron Yeshiva, it is in the city of Jerusalem. If you go to the Mir Yeshiva is also in the city of Jerusalem. So sometimes a yeshiva can be called by the name of its former city, and it moves locations. So we see that even though Jerusalem in the story of the Jewish people is obviously a more famous city, because of the long association of the yeshiva in the city of Tiberia, it retained the title of the Tiberia Yeshiva even when it moves to Jerusalem. Anyway, that it might be a cute and fascinating thing, but what we certainly see is that in this garden of spears, in this tolerant Muslim atmosphere, the Jews are allowed to move back to Yerushalayim. That they decide that Jerusalem is the eternal home of the Jewish people, and they want to move the yeshiva back from Tiberia to Jerusalem. At this period of time, most of the Jews, almost all the Jews, live in the Muslim world. Almost all the Jews live in Muslim lands, including in Spain. There are very small outposts of Jews in Italy, maybe certain parts of Byzantium, maybe just an inkling or two in maybe France, but very, very little to speak of. And so most of the Jewish world is covered in this Muslim caliphate. And we could ask the question of who are the authorities of the Jewish world. And really we see that there are 4 separate authorities that rule this land. One of which is the exilarch. The exilarch is the secular head of the Jewish community. And the exilarchs were rumored to be descendants of the house of David, and they form if you will, the political leadership of the Jewish community. And very often they are involved in appointing many of the other heads of the Jewish community. The other authorities of the Jewish world are the Gaonim. Let me just flip a slide here, because in today's world, the word Gaon means genius, right? If you say about somebody, oh, he's a Gaon, he's such a genius. Many people have heard of the Vilna Gaon, because the Vilna Gaon must seem to be an exceptional person, a person of genius-like status. But the term Gaon actually came from the formal name of the yeshiva. These yeshivas were known as Yeshivat Gaon Yaakov. And so the head of the yeshiva was simply known by that acronym Gaon. But most of them obviously had different names, and that was the name that was attached to the highest position in each one of those yeshivot. And there was the Gaon of the yeshiva in Tiberia, Jerusalem. He was the Gaon of Israel. And then you had the Gaons of 2 other locations, the 2 yeshivot of Bavel. One is the yeshiva of Sura, and the other one is the yeshiva of Pumbedita. Forgive my coughing. I am, thank God, I believe I have recovered, but I still have a little lingering cough here or there. Thank God I've survived COVID. I can add that to my resume. But going back, there's a strong interrelationship between the exilarch and the Gaonim. And just one example of that is that the Babylonian rabbi, whose name was Marzutra, he's the son of the Reish Giluta, he's the son of the exilarch, and he comes to the land of Israel in the year 520, and we can record 13 descendants of Marzutra who then serve as the head of the yeshiva in the land of Israel. And so again, I just want you to be able to focus on the fact that we have really good and strong evidence of the existence of activity in the land of Israel. We can tell you the names of the Gaonim. We can tell you their lineage. We can tell you where they some of their rulings, and the Gaonim had some very interesting roles to play in terms of leadership of the Jewish community. Okay, I just see something. Oh, thank you in the chat for the Refuah Shlema. I wanted to make sure I caught up on the chat. Okay, so just to show you how the relationship between these ideas of leadership and the unbroken chain with our community. So every Shabbat, without exception, we say a prayer called Yukum Porkan. So if you look in the Yukum Porkan, I just downloaded a fancy version of it. if you look in the Yukum Porkan, you'll see that in this prayer that we say, we pray for a number of institutions, right? It says, Lemaranan Rabbanan Chavurta Kadisha Diba'ara di Yisrael. This the important yeshiva, the holy yeshiva of the land of Israel. And then there is another yeshiva, the yeshiva of Udi Bavel, and also of Bavel. So that's the Babylonian yeshiva. And then, guess what? We have a third. We have the Reish Giluta. The Reish Kala, by the way, it doesn't deviate. The Reish Kala is a term referred to maybe the provost of the yeshiva. So he gets thrown in also. But you have all of those leadership groups are represented right here in this prayer, which we continue to say every Shabbos, even though I don't think there's my book on the Gaonim is right here. I'm gonna, in the back of the book, they have a catalog of all the Gaonim and their times. So I'm just going to look at when the last Gaon lived. The last Gaon lived in Surah was the Gaon the Gaon Yitzchak, who died in the year 1037, right? So there hasn't been a Gaon in Bavel in almost 1,000 years. In 15 years, we're 15 years short of 1,000 years from the death of the last Gaon, and we are still saying a prayer which links us inextricably to that period of time. Interestingly, by the way, one of the first reform innovations was to try and get rid of this prayer, and the Orthodox went crazy. How can you take it out of the Siddur? But I think that this is an important piece for us to have, especially considering people like Shlomo Sand, who wants to pretend like there's no continuity between the Jews of today and the Jews of ancient times. This prayer is a pin that every Shabbat you stick in your emotional, historical, conscious map that says, look, I am connected to my ancestors who lived in Bavel and in Israel, and my ancestors, and they were connected to the ancestors of the Talmud, who were connected to the ancestors of the Mishnah, who were connected to the Maccabees, who were connected to those who returned from Babylonia, who were connected to those who left and exiled in Babylonia, who lived in Jerusalem, etc., 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 etc. We have a great chain of provenance, and it is incumbent upon us to know that. Okay. So what were some of the powers of the Gaon? What's some of the evidence that we get from the Geniza itself? So this is here's where we get to our brass tacks facts on these Gaonim. So first of all, they had the power to appoint shochtim. They could appoint the cantors, chaverim, principals of the community, and judges. Why is the shochet the first on the list? Because one of the interesting things is that much of the money which supported the yeshivas in each of these locations was the money that they would get on the shechita. Because the Gaonim would be the ones who gave the hechshers, who had a certificate from your Gaon, the Gaon in land of Israel, that says, Chaim ben Shmuel, he is a kosher shochet according to the yeshiva in Israel. And some things never change. In certain cities, for example, Fustat, which is really a sort of a suburb of Cairo, in Egypt, both Babylonian authority and Israeli authority existed, and there were two markets. There was the Israeli market and there was the Babylonian market, and there was arguments between them about, were they both really allowed to give shechita? Were they both allowed to collect money? Right? It's just like the BCK and the OU have a fight over who gets to control this company. Like I said, some things never change. So, another thing to look at. I think I'm going to run out of time, and some of the very good feedback I've had is that these lectures tend to be so dense that sometimes it's better to do them in smaller chunks. So I'm going to try and do that. We'll talk a little bit more about excommunication. That's really a very important thing. They're the final word on matrimony and divorce. They're responsible for making sure that the community is a good community, especially in the eyes of the Muslims, right? You want to be able to be the person who makes sure that your people are law-abiding, that they are contributing to the empire, that they are a productive community. That's what you want to make sure. They have to be appointed by the consent of the community. They superintend the observance of religious precepts. They manage communal property. And they have a representative in every locality. And everyone's required to obey the Gaon. But as we see, sometimes authority is only as long as the tip of your spear. And one of the areas where they functioned most profoundly was in excommunication. So that means that if you didn't listen to the Gaon, the Talmud had already said that it was very hard to have real capital or corporeal punishment, or even to levy fines. That was very, very difficult, and the judges sort of lost that ability. So what became the force instead was the power of excommunication. And excommunication was quite a strong tool, because basically what it says is if you don't listen to the rules of the Gaon, you don't pay your debts, you don't follow the community rules, you inform on people to the non-Jewish authorities, we can excommunicate you. And excommunication means that you're not allowed to trade with other people, you're not allowed to talk to other people, you don't get aliyot in shul, you're essentially fully cut off. The most powerful part of that was probably the inability to trade, because at this point in time, Jews are less and less farmers and more merchants. And so that was a very significant power of the Gaon. Part of the problem was, though, that very often it was difficult to get everyone to enforce that kind of cherem. Because let's just say your major supplier of leather and you're a shoemaker is the guy gets put into cherem. Well, if you don't have leather, you can't make your shoes. It becomes a very difficult situation. And so these things you can see from the letters of the Geniza that one of the great areas of conflict was for the Gaonim to get people to actually abide by these excommunications. As you can see from this slide, one of the major reasons for excommunication was failure to pay your debts. And as I said, it was often hard to enforce the cherem, and we have examples of special letters where an individual promises to obey the rulings of the Beit Din and keep distance from the excommunicated. And this comes from the court records of Rav Daniel ben Aziza in the year 1057. I put that there because I think it's important to be able to say, okay, I know exactly what record to go look at to see where some of this activity takes place. I'll just do one other really quick power of the Gaon. A very important power of the Gaon was dispute resolution. If there was a problem in the community. And so there's an interesting problem. I pulled this one out because I just thought it showed us interesting texture of the community. In Caesarea, there was an argument over who was going to read Nishmat Kochai. So we think, okay, what's the big deal? Give it to one person, a different person. But that's not how this was seen, is that this was a very important thing, and this is how communities established their worth and their leadership, that you marry into that family, they're the ones who always lead Nishmat Kochai on Rosh Hashanah. It's a status that it gives you in the community. And this was the way in which the Gaonim helped to advance the most talented family in a real pure meritocracy. And Gill actually focuses on that idea that this was, in fact, this is how the Gaonim were successful in creating the meritocracy. In this particular example, there was a dispute there was the son of the beloved, the Ahuva, the Yeshiva, Elazar ben Yosef. He was the one who usually said it, but there was another notable, Chalfon al-Ramli, who wanted it, and the Gaon's answer was, okay, alternate years, share it, do it. It was some kind of attempt, but in the end, I believe in this particular case, the Gaon's attempt at achieving resolution of sharing it didn't actually work, and ultimately, I believe the son of the notable was the one who was the one to get this honor in perpetuity. Okay, so I still have more, believe it or not, and so here's what we have for our next class. We have to look at polygamy in the times of the Gaonim, and the Muslim influence on polygamy. We're also going to look at the Gaonic yeshivot and what and how they were governed, what happened there, what did a yeshiva actually look like, and I will get a little bit of texture of what Gaonic life looked like. And I'll try also and perhaps bring a little bit more of texture of what Jewish communal life was like. What were some of the issues that they dealt with, especially also how did they deal with their Muslim captors. And you can see that as much as I tried to keep this to 30 minutes, I'm already 13 minutes over my intended time period. So I'm going to we'll close the frontal presentation down now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Rabbi, fantastic lecture is also always one question. I mean, the period of enlightenment that sort of ensued afterwards. What was the transition? Is it a difference actually in the adherence to Islam, or is it more of a tribal difference as to those that were controlling the lands, or to what do you attribute?
Okay, so you mean when you say afterwards, do you mean after the Abbasids?
So immediately, if we talk about the period to just the Crusades, and then post Crusade, southern Spain under prior to the Catholic monarchs conquering the south.
So I would say that the wisdom of Baghdad, in terms of the translation of Aristotle into Arabic, so that's what gets into the hands of Maimonides, right? So Maimonides lives, in essentially he's in the 12th century, and so it is very much because of the library, if you will, the library of Baghdad, that you get a Maimonides in the next centuries, right? And so what happens is that the Muslim wisdom comes into Spain, and the Reconquista of Spain, which brings Christian Spain back to, and most of the names that we know, the great poets and rabbis, many of them are from Christian Spain, but the wisdom, actually, the Jews are sort of, if you will, they are the refrigerators of wisdom in that time, because the Muslims, as the Christians come in, it is the Jews who know about mathematics and accounting and poetry and philosophy that they can then teach back to the Christians. Aquinas, for example, is able to read Aristotle from a Latin which is translated from the Arabic. So without Baghdad, you don't get Thomas Aquinas. And when I went to university, they used to say that Aquinas was the baptism of Aristotle and Rambam was his Brit Milah. So, you can sort of see that how this goes. And I don't know if Tony David is on this call or Stan Sean, but the Baghdadi Jews know that they come from Stan, I see Stan is on here. Baghdadi Jews know that they are. Oh, Maddie Khalifa's here too, right? So the Baghdadi Jews know that they have better lineage than any of us. You know, you want to trace your lineage to Rashi, fantastic, but the Jews of Baghdad, you know, go back even further. They go to the Gaonim, and it was really a very, very special Jewish community. Unfortunately, I think it was in 19. Stan, you'll remind me the year 52 was the riots. That
No, they were in. You mean the Farhud?
where they
With
hung the
the
wealthiest
those-
Jew in the street.
40s, late 40s.
Had to be after the state of Israel, so maybe 49. There was pogroms in the middle of Baghdad. You know, and unfortunately, it's a sad end to a very celebrated Jewish community.
No, they want them back.
I would
They
too.
want the Jews back now.
I would too. All right, very good. Everyone have a fantastic night and stay safe.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very interesting class.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.